I just want to give you a very brief overview of what we plan to do. Actually, I mean, this exhibition may be rooted in the philosophical discussion of Cosmism, but it is also rooted very importantly in Anton's video work, in the 3 videos people are able to see in the exhibition, and this is where I would like to take the discussion. So what we're going to do is to more or less show a couple clips, show one longer clips from Anton's second video, which is called The Communist Revolution Was Caused by the Sun, and then I will screen 2 short clips from my own work as some kind of response, and in between, in the dialogue between these video works, I think we will try to have a discussion which may or may not resonate with many of the topics that were addressed yesterday and today. And having said that, I have to confess that I personally have no idea about Cosmism whatsoever, and you can, maybe if you have followed the discussion since yesterday evening, you can reconstruct the sort of terror which I am experiencing right now, feeling sort of forced in a way to reproduce and also to respond, to a lot of different topics that actually I have no idea of. Yet, it's like in school, someone points at you and says, you have to do it. So I will bravely volunteer to do it right now. And I think that actually there are 3 constitutive tensions or paradoxes, if you will, in this discussion, which probably cannot be resolved, but that's probably also the fun of it. Let me summarize it. So the first axiom is, and I think no one can doubt it after this discussion of these past 2 days, Cosmism may exist or not, period. Thank you. Okay. So the second one is a bit more tricky, since it seems that Cosmism is for everybody and will redeem everybody and absolutely everybody, except maybe if you're not Russian. And the third one is actually maybe the most baffling one. It is the proposition that immortality is something that may be desirable or not, and you can intensify it, and then you can escalate it to the point that it becomes absolutely lethal. And I think this is the most baffling proposition of Cosmism. The idea that immortality in a way can be something that is absolutely profoundly deadly, it will immediately kill you. And this is, I remembered something. It's a historical anecdote, and I have absolutely no expertise in this area, but something I remembered was this, the fact, actually, it is a fact that immortality and the pursuit of it was a very, very popular cause of death for Chinese emperors. In fact, over a period of 2,000 years, a lot of Chinese emperors literally killed themselves drinking immortality elixirs. And they were convinced, and this was a long-standing tradition in research, medicinal, and so on, that, if they drank enough mercury, laced with some other stuff, they would be immortal. And there seems to be as interesting characteristics. If you drink mercury, then you get really elated, and life feels great, and you say, you almost did it, you're almost immortal, but then, unfortunately, you die. And this seems to have become some sort of, also, then immediately after this became more or less clear, it was weaponized. And emperors who were, who people thought they should rather disappear, they were forced to drink the immortality elixir. So one could get rid of them if it suited. So I think this idea that, and this has actually also had very real consequences, the idea of immortality and whether you want it or not and how to get it or not is one thing. But this quest for immortality actually had sort of political, real-life consequences, because some of the emperors really instituted purges. including the burning of books and also of actual scholars, to focus science on the pursuit of immortality. So in that sense, immortality was not only this sort of regulative idea, but it had real political consequences, and this is one of the most fascinating aspects for me, is this, for me, seemingly constitutive tension, between immortality and death in the idea of cosmism. And of course, many of these paradoxes or, strands and fragments of this discussion reappear in the contemporary discussion about transhumanism, about cryonics, the extension of life, the abolition of death, either as a sort of uploading of minds into avatars, or the overcoming of biological barriers by all sorts of, medical options and menus. And this is why I think that considering this historical dimension is extremely important, because actually it does open up this discussion about transhumanism, into which, of course, many other traditional, I'd say, or historical elements come into play again, which are tied with mortality or even consciously inflicting death on certain groups of people and exterminating people. So basically, in the idea that humankind as such, or certain parts of humankind, it doesn't really matter, should be immortal, there is like an undercurrent. Very often the idea that this involves the elimination, what is called by Tsiolnikov, for example, the defective parts of the population. So these should not survive, and he's very, very explicit in naming these supposedly defective parts as dark people. So in that sense, it seems to me that it's very, very difficult to get rid of the element of eugenics, of the planning of population, of the sort of regulation of population in this question. And on the other hand, of course, you cannot, I think no one can deny that transhumanism, if you see it from the point of view of Neanderthals, is a completely different proposition, because from their point of view, and they were humans as well, we are actually the post-humans, right? And this kind of post-humanism, we don't really know how it was achieved, but definitely technology was involved, into bringing about humankind as such by, mainly developing the technology of fire, cooking, and so on. So basically all humans that exist today are sort of engineered, have been brought into being by technology to a certain extent. And if we see it from that perspective, we could say that basically any intelligence today is artificial intelligence from that point of view. So again, there is this kind of tension, between having to acknowledge that this kind of trying to bring about the immortality of humankind, or the improvement of it, is always accompanied by this dark undercurrent of extermination, yet it seems to be progressive anyway. So before I want to, maybe we should just screen the first clip now, and then I will ask you specific questions relating to that work. So this is a clip of about 10 minutes from the video, "The Communist Revolution Was Caused by the Sun." And maybe to launch more or less immediately into a question, I think, we have talked, or people have talked a lot about immortality and its theoretical, historical, religious foundation over these past days. But what I find very interesting and striking in this work, and also a question which hasn't been addressed at length, is how can one deploy art as some sort of transhumanist strategy or device, because I think that what we have seen in the video already has two different layers. On the one hand, there is a sort of conjuration on the level of content. People talk about immortality, about wanting to bring about immortality, the necessity of immortality, and so on. And then there is a second level, and this is maybe the one I would like to you to comment on, because throughout the trilogy, there is also a layer in which film or video, or the act of screening and watching a video, has a sort of operative function on the person, in the sense of basically intervening into the person's body and his or her health. So maybe you would like to comment on this level first.
Absolutely. But first, I thought that maybe I'd go back to the Chinese emperor's story, because one of the things that was a very interesting byproduct of sending all of these emissaries to try to find the elixir of immortality, and then sometimes poisoning the emperor, is this is apparently how Japan was discovered.
Yeah, maybe you shouldn't have discovered it. Discovered.
I like Japan.
There were people there. Okay.
Yeah. But this is basically to say that a lot of times the way things happen are completely unanticipated. For example, Viagra was discovered by looking for a high blood pressure medication, but instead something else came into being. So a part of me thinks that if actually immortality, if there will be the elixir, if there will be the medicine, the treatment, right, it's very likely that it will come about as a result of a complete unanticipated accident. Maybe while looking for weight control pills, suddenly something will be...
I think it's more likely that it's the other way around, actually. By looking for immortality elixir, by accident there will be a weight control.
But then basically, this is all to say that, I think one of the things, everybody has their own personal take on Cosmism, as you had a chance to see over the last couple of days. There is not a clear consensus on if it exists, what it is. Is it more of a religious thing? Is it more of a philosophical movement? Is it more of an artistic movement? And I think this is actually really wonderful, as long as it stays open and defies clear categorization, clear definition, it's still alive in that way, yeah. But I'm like everybody else, and I also have my take on it, yeah. And I think what has been becoming more and more interesting for me is almost like a kind of a very pragmatic, very boring sort of approach to it. That when one thinks about immortality, one does not really need to imagine some kind of a miracle or a kind of incredible, miraculous religious event or grandiose scientific breakthrough or some kind of Promethean-like event. Yeah, it could also come about by improvements in national healthcare system, by improvements in quality of food, by improvements in the condition of work, of life, of urban planning, of shelter, of very, very, very basic things that we use every day. And if they could extend our lifespans a little bit more and more and more and more, perhaps a point will come when it will be so long that for all practical reasons we are nearly immortal. But this will be a chain of very kind of mundane events, nothing too dramatic, yeah? And of course, I can't help but, at the moment in the United States, healthcare has been one of the sort of things that have been in the news all the time. And, just out of curiosity, I kind of looked into what was the first country that actually had a nationalized healthcare system. And it appears actually that it was Soviet Union, interestingly enough, yeah, which was in early 1920s. This idea of a nationalized healthcare is implemented there, whether it's fantastic healthcare or not, but it's very important that it's for all, in the Soviet Union. And, although I have absolutely no proof of that, I would like to think that maybe one of the reasons for this may have been some kind of gentle influence of certain cosmist ideas. Again, this is just a pure speculation. I really don't know. I have not done historical research, but maybe now to come back to your questions about the films and about...
the film is healthcare.
Well, it's a kind of an idea, but as I was...
It's not, it's not a joke. This is what the film, in one of its other chapters, declares, that basically if you watch a certain color or wavelengths of light, then this will have positive health effects. And I'm just thinking about, I don't want to interrupt you, but very briefly, I'm just thinking about that because, of course, as we know, and we discussed already, all these sort of healthcare systems, or sort of, let's call it gentle reformist, immortality project, have been in large parts of the world completely savaged, cut back, been under attack, and so on and so on. So basically, how do you comment on this? We're not in a situation where nation states as the Soviet Union, let alone the US, would be able to take on, even want to take on such kind of projects. So I'm just to extrapolate on my question, do you think that basically a sort of, how do you call it? How would you describe it? Constituency of video, would be able to take on this question. The international of film as a sort of healthcare system to compensate, for all these failing and dysfunctional and barely, operative healthcare systems.
Well, I think that the problem is with the word compensate, because, this was kind of a part of a discussion 10 years ago when the other project that I did in Berlin, which was called United Nations Plaza, which was a kind of a free experimental school that perhaps some of the people in this room have come to. But one of the criticism of it, or one of the critiques of this whole thing was that, all of this artist-initiated experimental projects are compensating for kind of a lack of good education, for a lack of state-run, state-funded institutions, that would provide it. And as maybe nice and admirable it is to organize projects like that, at the same time that lets the government off the hook, because then they don't have to do it. So I would hate for films to kind of short-circuit the actual healthcare system, and sort of create this kind of weak medicine that would some kind of a government official would use it to cut the subsidies to fund hospitals or something like that. But putting all of that aside, I think what was really interesting for me, of course, working with this material with Fedorov, with all of Chizhevsky, all of these incredible writers and thinkers, one thing I realized quite early on is that, in a way, of course, it is a kind of a philosophy, but of course it's also one thing that unifies them in a certain way is that they were committed to immediate social activism, to sort of immediate practical action. And it's kind of not an accident that even though Chizhevsky was a biophysicist, but he actually, most of his research had to do with blood circulation, with movement of blood in the human body that had medical applications. Bogdanov, incidentally, was also a medical doctor. He was a psychiatrist, and of course then experimented with blood transfusion. So a lot of people that were part of this sort of intellectual movement, or whatever you want to call it, a lot of them actually worked with things that had medical applications, because one of the ways to further the cause of immortality and perhaps even resurrection is to simply cure somebody who is ill at the moment and is in imminent danger of dying. And for me, this was a kind of a very important realization, because keeping that in mind, I realized that it would be, for me personally, totally futile to make a historical documentary about Cosmism, and if I was to communicate any of its ethos or any of its desires, I would actually have to somehow make them a part of this video. So so I was thinking about all kinds of things, and then just very accidentally stumbled on a discovery that was made by the American space program, NASA, in '93. They were trying to solve a very simple practical problem, because in conditions of zero gravity, your skin heals very, very slowly. So if you have a tiny paper cut, it continues bleeding for weeks. So they needed something to speed up the healing for astronauts, for cosmonauts in space, because of course any liquid that is circulating is a bit dangerous and it's not a good idea. And I don't know exactly how, but they stumbled on this very strange effect that the red light generated by LED light source, LED diodes, in a very particular range, in a very particular frequency, which is exactly 670 Hertz, has incredibly healing effect that expedites healing of human skin. And first they started using this kind of treatment on spaceships and space stations, but then of course it was very, very quickly adapted by the military, because they need something to patch up wounded special force soldiers and things like that, and cosmetics industry, because of course rejuvenating face, kind of rejuvenating skin, or making it younger and healthier is a very major concern of cosmetics industry. So, but then I kind of realized that, well, essentially film is color, light, and sound, and there is no reason why a screening of a film could not also be a kind of irradiation session, that while you sit there looking at the film, and maybe you're totally bored by it, maybe you find it interesting, or you dislike it, but it kind of doesn't matter, because it bombards you with these particles of red light that are rejuvenating your skin, that are having kind of a prophylactic effect on your body. So the artwork actually addresses you as a physical object, not merely a psychological subject. So that was in the first film. In the second film, I kind of thought about psychoanalysis, because one of the other things that I use in videos is the narrative. And the narrative can have healing potential, and there is clinical psychoanalysis used for terminating certain kind of addictions, that are harmful. And there's a very specific script that is used for this kind of sessions, which is interesting because, of course, you always work with a script, but this script has the capacity to actually heal, to improve your kind of health. So basically, in the second film, I used this clinical hypnosis to basically kind of suggest, to convince you to become immortal. And in the third film, it's again like a recent scientific discovery that was made at MIT just a few years ago, that flashing of light in a particular range and particular intervals in the range of 40 hertz, has a very interesting effect on your brain cells, and it cannot cure Alzheimer's disease, but it could reduce the loss of memory. So it could actually stimulate or enhance your memory. And so that's the therapist,
Okay, super. I will make a point in that in a more progressed point of the dialogue, where I actually argue that there are these two levels, of the video, which work in this sense. But for me, the most important is not the potential resurrection of humans or prolongation of life or whatever you want to call it, but actually the production of space in montage. And in order to make this point, I will show these short clips from my work and then discuss my thinking behind it. And just to introduce it briefly, I really had no even recollection of making a work which would connect in any way to the topics discussed, but actually I did, and it occurred to me. But I came to it from a completely different perspective, the perspective of media, because I asked myself the question, who is doing the outsourced 3D modeling and rendering that today's advertisement industry and entertainment industry requires? And I thought actually I would end up very quickly in India or the Philippines, but I did not. I ended up in Ukraine. And it turns out that large parts of the former employees of the aerospace sector, the rocket building industry, are now employed in 3D modeling and in the creation of games, very often war-related, and also virtual casinos is one of the other main industries, and also the 3D modeling of luxury real estate. So in a way, this is the trajectory of many actual people who were trained to work in space. I mean, to go to space, to fly to space, to build the machines to go to space. This is what they are doing. And I want to screen a short clip from a work called The Tower, which consists more or less from the renderings that these people produce and a documentary interview with one of them. What happens actually is that they made a video game about the Tower of Babel, which in their video game is sort of invaded by zombies. And I found this very interesting and important because the Tower of Babel, of course, is one of the first observatories of cosmos ever, and I think historically very, very important launch platform for the idea of the observation of the universe as such, which speaking of that, and also keeping in mind the sort of, hollowing out and devastation of space exploration as such, the real question, or one of the main questions that I'm asking myself now, in relation to the whole debate, but also to that work, is actually the question of ground control. You know, where is ground control actually in this work? You see, and actually in the next one, which I'm going to skip to, there is there is a very important location, which is the former National Observatory of Iraq, on a mountain somewhere in KRG, and it's been devastated, or it has two big holes in its roof, one made by an Iranian rocket and the other by an American rocket. So this begs to me the question, you know, we can talk about space, we can talk about immortality, we can talk about reaching things in the future, but what happens to the ground? What is the material base and how is it being devastated right now? And one thing that occurred to me now is that actually, if I ask myself, what is ground control? Where is ground control? Then for me, you know, as someone who grew up in the West, there's only one answer. And the answer is, of course, ground control is in Houston. Houston is ground control, right? Houston is, in the mythical idea of space exploration, is the place where engineers are able to solve every single problem, right? There are best minds, and they will fix every problem. Indeed, Houston is the place you call when you have a problem, right? So what happened to ground control is my real question. I think it's a very important question, that because maybe, and everyone knows what happens in Houston, right? I mean, Houston is a place that was basically engineered to the state it has been in now. It is an engineered, so-called artificial natural catastrophe. It is engineers who produced, you know, the type of underground control, you know, which is Houston now. And this seems to me a very important point, because it seems to imply that maybe the thing we need to produce, and I'm not going to use the word resurrect, is less people than space. And when I talk about space, then the idea of ground, who controls the ground? What is the base of this kind of enterprise, you know? Where are we launching it from? Isn't, you know, this idea so far into cosmos already, or outer space, that basically people are flying off while ground control is being devastated? So I think the production of space is a really important point. Maybe you would like to react to that.
Well, yeah, because I mean, what's happening in Houston is what's happening right now. But as we were shooting these films, actually, Tisha Mukherjee is here, who traveled with me to film the first of the trilogy, and one of the places where we filmed is actually Crimea. It never made it into the film in the final version, but this is where the ground control for the first space flight of space flight with Gagarin took place, and basically it's really incredible, but it's a gigantic complex. It's an array of these huge dishes and all of that. But they're so huge, they're like 10 times the size of this building, and they're kind of rusting, abandoned, kind of decrepit. You sense total entropy, like the end of, and there are basically small towns attached to them of people that work there, and there are basically just some pensioners that cannot afford to move, and there are no services, there are no shops, like they're kind of living in very, very, very strange condition. And then of course, where the space flight landed is actually Karaganda, where we shot the second film, which was basically a gigantic labor camp so it's very ironic that cosmonauts went to orbit, but where they returned is they landed in prison, So I don't know how to read all of this kind of metaphors, but they are quite strange. So I don't know where the ground control is. Do you?
Good question. No, but I mean the second film, I think I know, yes, is precisely about that. I'm not going to show you because of time, but it goes to that location, to the former National Observatory of Iraq, which is now actually a military base, and it tries to. There's a sort of fictional story which tells the story of a space agency for intraterrestrial space travel, implying that the sort of outer space and unknown and whatever that used to be imagined at the big unknown somewhere else is actually here, and this is the place that has to be explored, the existing space, but seen in this work from a different angle. Mm-hmm. This is the point of the intraterrestrial space agency, that actually it reconstructs, or it constructs even the space, because the space is what seems to be missing. I mean, apart, let's say, from the people, if you say that if you assume that they are missing the dead.
Well, I remember you suggesting that SETI should redirect their arrays to look for intelligent life on Earth. So it seems you consistently want to point everything back to this planet somehow.
It's a reflector strategy, like Traverse Satellite, The idea was, people spend so much time looking for extraterrestrial intelligence, so why don't we look for human intelligence? Is there any, could we find it? There could be a mission, it's even very cheap, probably, or maybe even not cheap, but it would be a fraction of the cost of looking for alien intelligence. And I'm very sure, I know for a fact that the reconstruction of terrestrial space can be done at a total fraction of the cost and expense and speculation of the extraterrestrial one. So this is why I think it should be priority. But to come back to this point, and maybe I think we have to also open up the question, the panel for Arseni and Trevor, to come back to my point about montage. The point that I wanted to make is that given, for me, the importance of the production of space, and also given the existence of these paradoxes which cannot be reconciled, apparently, in the idea of Cosmism, I think that actually the most important formal aspect for me is in the montage of the works, because in film theory it's a kind of complete no-brainer, but space is actually being constructed if by montage. If you have more than two perspectives, then you do not only represent a filmic space, you produce a filmic space, right? And for me it's very interesting how you articulate these very, very different spaces which at the first glance seem nothing to have to do with either Cosmism nor Russia whatsoever, and that they are allowed to coexist. And also video can do something that text in a way can't, which sometimes, especially in its academic versions, has to, fall either head or tail towards one theory or not. Video can actually accommodate, these paradoxa by, you have these guys in the film who come riding on a horse and ask, who are these crazy foreigners? And so video is able, in a way, to articulate these contradictions, which could also be read, as the contradictions between, let's say, a Russian originated idea of universalism and the cosmos, and others, like the one Trevor mentioned, a Western or American, to be more precise, idea of cosmos, of space flight, and I think that the space that would need to be constructed would need to be an articulation, actually, of all these different paradoxes next to one another without trying to sort of sublate them, because it doesn't seem to be possible. Would you like to react to that? And then I think we should open.
No, just as you were talking, I remembered that there was, I don't remember the quote specifically, but apparently Eisenstein wrote something quite specific, which is usually cited as his connection to Cosmism, which has to do with montage. But sadly, I do not remember the quote. I think it's on the timeline in the other gallery, but it's very close to what you were just saying.
Yeah, so as I said, the solutions are in the gallery. They cannot be here, in my view.